Well, another COP conference has come and gone, COP being the world's supposedly prime international summit to tackle the preeminent challenge of our time, which is, of course, climate change. Once again, the hub's own Dr. Joe Vipond returns to Calgary, Alberta after having borne witness to COP29 and reporting back to us the copious amounts of greenwashing and disinformation as he sees them with daily reports that we call around here Debunktion Junction. Hey there, Joe. Welcome back to Calgary, Alberta.
Well, it's good to be home. I'm not going to lie. It's nice to look outside and see it cold and snowy. It makes me happy to have winter here.
Yeah. That's we weren't sure after last year whether we would have a blanket of snow again this year. So yep, I'll we'll take it. So I guess you've had a little bit of time to digest the COP conference. You went over there. You were there every day. I guess my first question to you would be, what's your perception of the
Yeah,
outcomes?
I mean, there's a lot of elements to a COP. There's various negotiations, but there's a lot of worrisome elements to this year's COP. This was supposed to be a finance COP, so this was all about, we know what we need to do. There have been commitments made at previous COPs, and how are we going to do that? In particular, for developing countries, because developed countries are rich. There's never been a society as rich as we are today. Surely we can find the money to transition to save our souls. But for the developing countries, they don't have that same access to capital. And so this was going to be to determine how to do that. And essentially, although they've got some numbers and some words written on paper, the general sense is that it's failed. The commitments don't begin until well into the next decade. They're not enough money when you factor it out for inflation. It's very similar to the 100 billion that was promised, a while back. I think it was 2008 or something along those lines. And so there's real concern that the energy transition is going to be harder for developing countries, even though they've done the least to cause the climate crisis, and in many ways are being impacted the most by some of the extreme weather.
Yeah, and then I guess I've also just been reading that there's some of that money that goes to those third world countries are in the form of interest-bearing loans. So we end up uh, doing a thing where we end up hurting those countries more than we're helping, maybe.
Yeah, many of these countries already have incredible debt that much of their GDP, much of their annual budget goes towards servicing those loans, and we're planning on adding more. So there was a lot of um, effort by civil society to ensure that this money would come in the form of grants and not loans, and that didn't work out so well.
So you've now been there. How many cops have you been at now, Joe?
Three and a half. I count a half because the first one I went to was Glasgow with Sadie, my daughter, and I was there essentially as a chaperone. I wasn't there as a participant. We didn't have badges. We stayed in the green zone. Mostly, I supported her during that period. So really, I've been to the last three authoritarian petrostate cops. So I've had a very
Hmm.
skewed version of the way the cops are supposed to go.
Well, yeah. I mean, is it skewed or is it is it a feature? Is it a bug? But
Yeah.
the what are you thinking are the big differences, let's say, between this year and last year? I mean, you've already mentioned that this has more of an economic focus. And I mean, I'm thinking about also blue zone versus green zone. So just for the benefit of our listeners, blue zone is where all of the the delegates are and the official business goes on, and the green zone is where the activists are primarily located. Um,
Not entirely true,
okay,
actually.
okay, go ahead.
So the way it works is the blue zone is where the negotiations are. And the blue
Hmm.
zone, so when you hear a number like, oh, there were 65,000 people at this COP, um, those are all people with badges, all
Okay.
people with access to the blue zone. And so those people are there to observe and try and influence the negotiations. And for the most part, that's civil society. The green zone, is external to the blue zone, and it's primarily for locals. It's primarily so that um, Bakuians, I don't know if that's the right term, but people from Baku are able to visit and engage in COP without that fancy UNFCCC badge. And so there are pavilions in both. I would say there are more country pavilions in the blue zone and more business pavilions in the green zone, but that's
Okay.
not exclusively that way. Last year, if you'll recall, in Dubai, the Alberta Oil and Gas people had a pavilion in the blue zone. Saskatchewan government had a pavilion in the green zone. So you'll see a little bit of elements of both. Um, and there are talks going on in both areas at the pavilions. So I spent 1 day in the green zone this year. Most of my time is spent in the blue zone.
And okay, so what do you think the prime differences were coming out of this COP?
Well, I mean, I think there has been a trend to having these authoritarian petrostates run these events. Um, but even though Dubai is an authoritarian petrostate, there was a sense they wanted to get some good PR out of this. They wanted to win. They wanted to come out of it looking like a climate hero. Kind of got the sense from Azerbaijan that they didn't give a crap whether they
Yeah.
had a success. If they just threw a wrench into the gears and things didn't work, that was okay. The goal was to cause trouble, not to alleviate trouble. And so I think that's why we got the outcomes that we did. There's also this really weird thing that last year the words transition away from fossil fuels were finally put in the text. Can you imagine at COP28, after 28 COPs, they finally were able to say the word fossil fuels out loud, and we, as you know, the rest of the globe, were like, wow, this is amazing. We put the word fossil fuel in there. And this year, apparently Saudi Arabia went in and unilaterally removed those words from the text. I have to go and read the news story. It sounds farcical to me that this could have happened, but they unilaterally removed the words from the text. And so that was not included this year. But yeah, I think that's the big difference is one country wanted to look good and the other country didn't care about looking good.
hmm Yeah, and so to me, my takeaway is there's less reason for people that care about climate to be excited after this COP than even the last COP, and of course, the last several have had a lot of cynicism about what could possibly happen there. I don't know if it's, if COP28 was maybe one half step forward, is this a full step back, or what's your sense?
Doesn't matter really. We still have to
Yeah,
fight. So
yeah,
no matter what the outcome, you and I and the rest of people that want a safe, livable planet for our kids still have to do our own thing. I will say that because of the shenanigans that went on at this COP, there was a lot of attention that was put towards how poorly designed these are to get positive outcomes. I
right.
really encourage the listeners to read, and maybe we can put it, attachment in your social medias to the Club of Rome letter that came out
Yeah,
2 Fridays ago. Some very smart people, including Christine Figueres, who's the previous UN climate envoy, uh, put together some thoughts on how to make the COP better and some pretty simple stuff. Like we need to vet
yeah.
countries to make sure that they actually want climate action, that they're doing the right thing on climate action. If they're going to host COP, we got to make sure that fossil fuel industry isn't in there subverting not just the fossil fuel industry, but countries that predominantly get their revenue from fossil fuels aren't in there subverting the process. And so my hope is that although it will be hard to reform the process, maybe it's so obviously corrupted that now is the time that we can get some change.
So yeah, I was reading that letter. I was paying attention to Professor Catherine Hayhoe's feed on Blue Sky, as I think every climate person in the world should and maybe is. But as far as that letter goes, there were seven recommendations. One was a strict eligibility criteria for host countries that we talked about, streamlined for speed and scale of actual climate action, mechanisms for implementation and accountability, so that we know that these promises are actually, have some teeth to them and matter. Robust tracking of climate financing, so it doesn't cripple the poorer nations that we're supposed to be helping, which we talked a little bit about. Amplifying the voice of authoritative science, recognize the interdependencies between poverty, inequality, and planetary instability, and then enhancing equitable representation. So, that speaks to the fossil fuel invasion that goes on at these things. Are
Mhm.
there anything else? Does anything else stick out to you that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the other one thing that was really talked about a lot at this COP was that um, a lot of the gender and rights language was removed from the text, and this is really important because we know that climate not preferentially over um, sorry, my jet lag brain is searching for words, but unequally impacts women over men,
Mhm.
and of course unequally impacts impoverished people over rich people. And so a lot of that language was removed, and you probably would guess the countries. It was Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt that were fingered as the countries that were really causing trouble on those things. And because it's a consensus process, although it's kind of a weird consensus process, but ostensibly a consensus process, doesn't take too many bad actors to cause challenges.
Hmm. So I'm going to throw a curveball at you. While all this was happening, of course, this was, you and I spoke prior to you going to COP, and that was shortly after the election. We talked a little bit about how that impacts things. But the other thing that happened, well, all in the midst of all this, is there was a mass exodus from Twitter over to Blue Sky, and people, academics and scientists, are enjoying this new space where we get to talk um, freely about all this without having all of the muckrakers and throwers coming at us, and then we've also got it just seems like it's this place where we can speak freely again, and we look back at where Twitter was and how awful it was and how free we feel over in Blue Sky, and it's hard to imagine Twitter ever being useful. And I just kept thinking that I was drawing an analogy in my mind that Twitter seems to me like the COP conferences. So if Twitter is to COP29, then Blue Sky is to blank, is what I was. What's the fix? What's the better place for all this? And I understand that the UN plays a critical role for these COP conferences, and maybe we could talk about throwing out a baby with the bathwater. But I feel like activists, the majorities all over the world want climate action, and these COPs don't reflect that. And do you have any ideas about, like, do we need to build up something separate than COP, or is it possible to reform COP given the nature of the United Nations and veto powers by petrostates like Russia? How do we go forward, Joe? Save the world for
Yeah.
us right now.
Well, I don't know if I can actually do that, but I can tell you about
Right.
a couple of the other processes that are going on. There's a London Climate Week every June, where civil society and businesses and some governments engage, and a New York Climate Week in September, which is coincidental with the UN General Plenary that happens every year. And so those are what I understand increasingly becoming important spaces for some of these discussions to happen. We're also seeing that some of the actions on climate are being taken outside of the regulations governmental process. Like, when you have sub 2 cent a kilowatt hour solar, and plummeting prices of batteries, it's not too far in the future where you can see a world where, policy doesn't matter as much as economics. I'm still a huge fan of policy. I think policy is really important. So I would prefer a world where policy drives the change in an equitable manner that's, acknowledges the urgency, that ensures that inequity doesn't happen in the distribution of the energy transition. But if I can't have regulations and policy, then at least I live in a world where innovation and pure economics are driving things.
Hmm. Well, I guess we've always got more work to do, and you and I talk all the time about wouldn't it be nice if we could focus on something, if everything were in place and we were just working on fixing problems. What's your focus now that you're back here in Calgary?
I got an op-ed that I've written, so I've submitted that, and so I'm like hoping to see that goes forward. Honestly, in the short term, it's figuring out the jet lag and catching up on emails. Those are like, um, kind of the bare minimum of activities that I need to do. And it won't be long before my schedule gets filled again. We just have this new coal mine that's being proposed in um, the southwest corner of our province. We have lots of
Hmm.
trouble with the AER making decisions that seem to be um, preferentially favoring industry over citizens and our province's lands and airs. Um, there's lots of work. There's lots of work ahead of us.
Well, Joe, thanks for your tireless advocacy and for going over there and doing the important work of bearing witness to these conferences. I'll just mention to our audience that Joe and I are both proud to be co-founders of the Calgary Climate Hub, an organization that we believe in and that we hear back does good work. So anybody that's watching, if you feel like donating, the Calgary Climate Hub is doing its fundraiser right now. Every cent goes to climate action right here in Calgary, Alberta, and it's a tough dollar for climate in Alberta. And beyond that, you can always tune in to the Climate Lens podcast. It's our monthly show, 30 minutes. We'll bring you right up to speed on the topic of the day. Yeah, and that's anything you want to close with, Joe?
Oh, I'll just mention that for myself, it's fascinating to wear that Alberta cap and kind of push against some of the Alberta oil and gas presence there. I also wear another hat there, and that's the health hat. I'm
Right.
still a practicing physician. I recognize that link between climate and health, and that for many people, it's more of a motivator to do the right thing than trying to drive less or fly less for polar bears or tree frogs. And so I'll continue to wear that hat. And I do think that that's becoming an increasingly important part of COP, and that's one of the reasons why I go. When I go, I don't know if I'm making a difference, but I'm trying, and
Mhm.
that's the least that I can do is try as hard as I can. So.
I
Uh,
suppose we should give a shout out to the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, aka CAPE, of which you are also, I think, a co-founder as well, are you not?
Not a co-founder, but I'm past president. And yeah, we're doing amazing work. And 12 months from now, Belém, Brazil, for COP30, and every 5 COPs, it's what we call a big COP. So if you remember, Copenhagen was a big COP, Paris was a big
Right.
COP, Glasgow was a big COP, and now Belém is a big COP. And these big COPs are the ones where maybe more change will happen. And I think the current Brazil government is caring about the climate. So hopefully they will actually be pushing for positive change rather than dragging their
And,
heels.
and that's the next COP.
Yep, Belém, Brazil.
Okay, well, that we'll stay tuned for Debunktion Junction fans. Okay, Joe, thanks again, and we'll just keep doing what we're doing, I guess, eh?
Well, hey, it's important work, and I appreciate what you do and what the hub does. It's an amazing organization.